Today's guest is Chris from Uptown. Chris, welcome to the show. Really looking forward to our conversation. Would love if you could kick us off with a bit around your founder origin story that led you to starting Uptown. What was that, gap you saw in the market, and then give us some context on the business today.
Yeah, and really, so the origin story of Uptown creation at uptown.com is that it was an agency we started while I was in pharmacy school with one of my business partners now. And it really started as a way to drive audiences to a physical product that we were selling at the time. And so, long story short, that led us down the path of Instagram. We spent about 2 to 3 years in the Instagram growth space, realized that our clientele really cared more about an attributable ROI and being able to see the linear metrics. On Instagram, you can do a lot with followers and follower count, but that doesn't always lead to dollars. So we started to play around with LinkedIn because I was in pharmacy school at the time and building my professional audience. I was thinking about going to law school. So I was actively connecting with anyone who was a pharmacist and a lawyer at the time. And that was kind of my intro to LinkedIn. But we started to run a little pilot with some of our clients. They started to book meetings and see the line between Uptown helped us book this call that closed into revenue. So very clear business case. And that was around 2019, I want to say. So since 2019, we've kind of been a LinkedIn focused agency, had some evolutions along the time, but our primary clientele ends up being B2B software and service companies that are in kind of that mid-market SMB range of 3 to 50 million roughly.
Yeah, very cool. And talk a bit about the core services that you offer and how you've landed on that. I mean, you deliberately said no, I'm sure, to a lot of things as well, right? In terms of maybe more other channels or other strategies on LinkedIn. So talk about your core focus in terms of LinkedIn outbound and why you're so laser focused there. Where's with the opportunity?
Yeah, outbound's always been the focus because, again, it's the most linear way that we can prove, we did this thing that led to a new client for our clients. And it really stems back to the Instagram growth days of there's so many practices that existed in Instagram growth. And anybody listening to this that's familiar with the range of 2015 to 2020 of Instagram growth, it was kind of the Wild West of followers and everything. But our principle back then was always figure out where people hang out on the internet and try to find those intent signals that you can find. So as an example, back in the day, we had a client who was a wine consultant. So he would help really high-end individuals kind of curate their wine collection. So something that we did for that person was, if you're sitting there and thinking how do I find people that like wine? That's not always the most intuitive place. You might go to a Reddit thread, you might find a YouTube video and people commenting on that. But using Instagram, what we were able to do was we targeted a bunch of wine accounts and the people commenting on those wine accounts to then do curated direct outreach for this wine consultant. So not only were we able to know that somebody was using Instagram at the time, we were able to know that they were interested in wine. And then a lot of times the comments that they were leaving were their favorite types of wines. So this consultant was able to reach out already knowing that they prefer reds or they prefer whatever type. I don't know that much about wine, so I'm not even going to try to butcher the names. But that philosophy of finding true intent signals was always the philosophy that we approached. And so when we came to LinkedIn, that biggest intent signal for us was, first and foremost, is somebody using LinkedIn? So something that I've always preached is the posted on LinkedIn in the last 30 days or changed jobs in the last 90 days, those filters on Sales Navigator, because I've seen so many people do outreach on LinkedIn and not make it work, but a lot of their volume is going to people that don't log into LinkedIn or just use it as kind of a job platform. So that was the first unlock for us for Outbound, is if you focus on people that are actually using LinkedIn as a platform, you can get a much higher response rate. So that was the first game that we uncovered on LinkedIn, I want to say, that made us a lot different than a lot of the bot and automation companies out there. And that's kind of been the core philosophy as we've grown, is find active people on LinkedIn, reach out about a problem that you can help solve versus a solution that you can sell into, and good things usually happen from there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's interesting that, we approach our businesses and our respective LinkedIn agencies from different angles, while serving the same purpose, right? So at Frontier, we start off with pretty heavy on the strategy side and things like positioning, just being super clear on, okay, who are the buyers? How are we going to design your landing page, which is essentially where you're probably going to get more traffic than your website from LinkedIn if you're doing things correctly. So how do we turn that profile page into a high converting sales asset, being super clear on who you help, how do you help them, how can someone take the next step, take easy action, and then building content assets based on that buyer journey from awareness to consideration, education to conversion. And so every piece of content is purpose-built to move someone further down that funnel. And we're essentially like building trust assets, right? To create familiarity and trust. And then the connection strategy is a part of this, call it like a three-pronged approach. And they all work really well together because clarity of signal is probably the most important thing. Oftentimes we take a look at someone's profile and it's not super clear. What is your service? Who specifically do you help? How can someone take that next step? And so it's interesting seeing founders and businesses and marketing agencies start with just the content side of things or specific strategies in a silo without thinking more holistically. So and then, where you come in with the outbound, I think that's super important. Oftentimes people think like build it and they will come, but it takes a lot of accumulated trust over a long period of time for that to truly happen. And so I like your approach of, okay, how do we identify the right people who are active on the platform, who we want to have a conversation with and just take many shots on goal and know there's a kind of a predictability around that. So maybe you walk through that funnel, right? So in a given month, what does that outbound engine look like in terms of volume of messages and how does that trickle down into booked calls?
Yeah, and so things have changed on LinkedIn over the last 5 years. I think the major changes started to happen like 2020, 2021, where the volume that you could do on LinkedIn was cut pretty severely. So LinkedIn used to be a place where there weren't really like hard and fast numbers of number of connection requests you could send. You could send somewhere between like 500 to 1,000 per week. And then you would just get a block. And a block was really, really bad back in the day. Like you didn't know when the block was gonna release. But LinkedIn made a change, I want to say around 2021, but somewhere in that era where they cut volume pretty significantly and made it so even though they don't publish this, like it's very clear that the limit of connection requests now is 200 per week. And it's actually a goal to hit that every week instead of this block of like, you can't send any more connection requests being a bad thing. Now that is kind of the goal because it releases. And so it releases between 6 and 7 p.m. Central Standard Time on Sundays is where you can start sending connection requests. But so if you send your 200 per week, that gets you to 800 per month. And that's kind of the top of funnel number that we think about when we approach outbound on LinkedIn. And so if you're targeting people who have posted on LinkedIn in the last 30 days who also fit, all your other target market and ICP profiles from job title, company size, industry, what you'll see is that about 10 to 20% of that target market ends up being that most active group. And when you send 200 connection requests to that most active group, you'll get somewhere between 30 to 40% connection acceptance rate. So off of the 200 per week, the 800 per month, 30 to 40% of those people will accept a blank connection request. And so from there, kind of how that trickles down is that ends up being somewhere between 250 to 300 new first degree connections per month. And we'll typically see a 20 to 30% overall reply rate from those 250 to 300. So those are responses all the way from positive, neutral, and negative. And we actually try to tie sentiment to the responses that we're getting so then we can use that on the back end to refine our messaging. But out of those 20 to 30% that respond to a message, about 15 to 25% will be what I consider kind of like highly positive responses. So those are either people agreeing that they have a problem or looking to get on a call or some sort of highly positive response. And then from there, we'll try to book about 60% of those positive replies into meetings. So that all kind of trickles down from that 800 top of funnel number to 250 to 300 new first degree connections to somewhere between 4 to 12 meetings being booked per month. But being as close to kind of SQLs or sales qualified leads as possible because of the messaging that we approach things with, which is pretty direct and to the point.
Yeah, talk about that direct message, because it sounds like there's not a whole lot of, again, personalization. Maybe talk about your personalization versus relevance, but it sounds like it's a pretty templated message, and you've done a lot of trial and error and iteration, and you've landed on a fairly direct, templated, like hard kind of ask versus maybe some people would, actually our approach is a bit more of like a value driven, where we'll send a resource and like ask a question, and that leads to some volume, similar kind of ranges, 25 to 35% in terms of reply rates. But talk about your approach and maybe share that specific templated message and why you've landed on that.
Yeah. And so at the end of the day, we try to be practitioners of outbound. And so things will always change and the market will always shift. But what we're seeing right now is that shorter, more relevant messages outperform longer and even short personalized messages. And the metric that we're tying that to isn't necessarily response rate or even positive response rate. We're trying to tie it to revenue because we noticed early on that the last thing that we want is to book more meetings for a client, but have the quality of those meetings kind of be more sporadic. Clients usually, when they work with us, prefer less meetings, but all of those meetings being really high quality compared to more meetings and then it being all over the place. So at best, I think that over personalization can give you mixed signals on why somebody's responding to a message. So like if you use the classic, like call out somebody's last post or call out the college somebody went to or call out a restaurant that's in somebody's location, you end up getting people that are responding to that instead of responding to the problem that you're addressing. If you can tie those things together, I think that personalization can work well to get a boost. But especially when you're a company that, still might be trying to find product market fit, still might be trying to find outbound messaging that's working really well, I think that a lot of those personalization signals can muddy the water of what somebody's actually replying to in terms of a problem to solve. So if we approach it from a perspective of, I care more about the conversations leading to a closed deal than the conversation leading to a conversation, then the philosophy that we kind of approach it with is, for an initial message, keep it as short as possible. So usually it's about 3 sentences and keeping it under 75 words, but then be very direct with why you're talking to this person. So I call it like addressing the elephant in the room. Why is this person talking to me? Because whenever somebody gets a cold outbound message, that's what goes up in their head, is like, why is this new person that I don't know saying words to me, and what do they want from me? But if you're able to like be pretty direct with what you want, then a lot of their guard goes down, for better or for worse. Sometimes it's going to be people that have no interest at all, but I see that as like a positive signal, because then that gives you a feedback loop that then you can go and adjust targeting or adjust messaging kind of correlatedly. So the message that we see working the best and the pieces of it are, first and foremost, starting with a pattern disrupt. So if you look at your inbox right now, there's probably going to be a lot of people saying, hi, Rohan. Hey, Rohan. Thanks for connecting with me. I'd love to add you to my network. All these like cliches that we've come to know on LinkedIn. So if you start with words that aren't those, your message is already going to stand out in the inbox. And the goal of that, in my mind, is to get somebody to click. So that's kind of the first barrier. Once you get a new first degree connection, the next thing you need to get is somebody to open your message in the first place and not just let it sit. So starting with a pattern disrupt gets that open. And then the second half of the first sentence is usually where we're pretty direct of why we're reaching out. So something like, I know this is random, but I'm chatting with VPs of sales who know their team should be doing more on LinkedIn to generate new revenue. That's the line that's currently working the best for us. And that second half of the sentence, we're calling out the job title. We're calling out like the thing that they know should be happening or the problem that they can solve. So that's all in a single sentence. And it's pretty packed, but it gets right to the point. And then what you have, so when we analyze campaigns, if we have a low response rate from there, it's pretty easy for us to consider that like somebody stopped reading at that point for the most part. That's the assumption that we make if we have a campaign that's out of metric, which allows us to make adjustments to that second half of that first sentence. So then the second sentence is usually what we call at a high level line. So it's something to the extent of like, at a high level, we help X type of company achieve Y result in Z time frame. That can shift, but it's usually like the value proposition or the brief elevator pitch. And then third sentence being call to action. And what we're seeing work the best right now is somewhere between like a hard and soft call to action. So hard call to action is ask for a meeting. Soft call to action is ask for permission to do something. Somewhere in the middle, what's working for us is, would it be all right if we shared a few ideas? And then we usually tie it back to the problem statement from the beginning. So would it be all right if I shared a few ideas to generate new revenue on LinkedIn? And what we see with that message framework is it's 3 sentences. Basically, the first and third sentence repeat themselves of the problem. So you get this really clean data on either you're hearing crickets from the market or you're getting responses. And then based on those responses, you're either hitting that positive response number or you're not. And it gives you data to be able to tweak off of.
Okay, interesting. And so it sounds like if the numbers are out of metric or below baseline, based on all the data that you collect, you would tweak that second sentence, that value prop sentence, and then the third one as well in terms of what that call to action is.
Yeah, and so actually it's the second half of the first sentence. So it's what we call like our problem statement. So a lot of times the second sentence stays the same because it's like the elevator pitch. Like if you're saying it in a way that isn't taking too long, it shouldn't really change a ton just because it's what you do as a company. But the second half of the first sentence being that like problem statement is where we put a lot of the tweaking. And then you're right with like the third sentence. And those two things usually like shift together.
Yeah. I like that because yes, you are like pitch slapping in that first message, which can be off-putting for some people who are, say, not in market, but you are being clear and direct. And then also it sounds like the call to action is also pretty soft as well, right? It's like, would it be all right if I sent these resources that are going to be relevant for you to get some value and some education out of, or whatever else it might be. And so there is that balance of like you're stating the problem to be solved, why it's relevant to them, and then it's like asking a question if they'd like to see more. So yeah, I see how there is that balance and there's a lot of clarity in that, and you're getting, yes, you might be off-putting a few people that are like I just accepted and now they're pitching me like right away. But the people, maybe you're polarizing in the right way, right? In terms of who you want to reply and ultimately optimizing for pipeline and revenue.
And the other thing that I'll say is the goal of it also is to get like that in-market audience as quick as possible, because you're going to have people that, you know, would respond to a more aggressive message if you lead with a softer message. And it's a lot easier to dial back the tone than it is to like reverse it. So if you lead with like a really soft call to action and like networking message, you're going to get tons of responses. But to be able to take those conversations into like where you want them to go of like solving problem and revenue, it's going to take a lot more effort to turn those conversations from like, hey, how's it going? How's the weather? Into like, do you want to buy this thing? But if you do take the opposite approach, you can always like come softer later, and you can always give them the out. But the benefit of that is you get the people who are most likely to buy earlier on in the funnel, which becomes important.
That makes sense. There's always a trade-off, and the pitch is going to be made at some point in the conversation, right? That's why you are engaging. And so are you making it earlier on where the opportunity cost is lower of like wasted and expended time and effort on both sides? Or is it happening during that phone call where, you know, you're kind of like doing that switch and now the person's like, okay, now here it comes, and maybe they're not in market and there's more time expended because you're speaking to more people who are not in market, right? Or in that 5% ready to buy now. So I like that. That makes a lot of sense. So then do you have a sequence tied to this? Are there follow-up emails tied to that first email? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so typically the sequence, if you will, that we follow, all of the stuff that we send is manual, but it's still sequenced, is typically we're going to send 4 messages in the first month of being a connection with somebody, and then follow up quarterly. So in the first year, what that looks like for somebody is usually they're going to receive like 7 messages being a first degree connection. That's like the happy balance of being persistent enough, but also not annoying people. And then the words that you say matter a lot, because if you send like paragraphs upon paragraphs, use a bunch of M dashes, make it look like it's AI, people are going to get a lot more frustrated. But if you are pretty direct and it's a good problem you're looking to help somebody solve, then you start conversations, but you also get people to opt out. So typically so we talked about the first message. Typically the second message we'll send will be something like a case study. So it's working really well for us right now is, forgot to mention, we just helped X company do Y thing. If we were able to help you do something similar, would that be worth a conversation? So tying it back to like social proof, but then also like being very direct with the thing that you can help somebody do. And it's only 2 sentences. The third message is usually just a typical nudge. So something like thoughts ? Or thoughts first name ? And then you let the 2 previous messages kind of do the heavy lifting. And then the fourth message is what I call a loose breakup message. So breakup messages usually come from e-com and like cart abandonment. You put something in your cart and they email you, did you forget this thing? I call it a loose breakup message because this is cold outreach. Like, these people didn't ask us to message them in the first place, but the goal of it is to give them an out. So addressing that, timing might be off for doing the thing. So it looks like now is not the right time to solve whatever problem. So again, you're bringing it back to this overarching problem that you can help solve. And then something like, before I mark you as no fit, if we were able to help you do X in Y time frame, would that be worth a conversation? And then giving a PS of, PS, just let me know if I'm totally off base here, or if it's something else. And we'll get a lot of people to respond of like, I've been on vacation, or I just changed jobs, I just lost my job, I'm not the right person at the company. So you end up getting more intel with that message. And that's kind of like the goal of the final message, in my opinion, is to like get more intel that you can use in the future. And I think that's a common theme with the approach that we take, is start with what most people would consider like the most aggressive approach, and then wean down all the way to like the least aggressive thing. So for follow-ups after that, that's when I think like lead magnets come into play. You're trying to get some sort of action. So for a lot of people running ads, if you get somebody to visit your website, you can retarget them with ads. So what's the lowest barrier to entry that you could give somebody something that could get them to your website, so you could start seeing some sort of benefit that isn't direct meetings today?
I like that. Yeah, we generally see, again, like every piece of content has a specific function and reaches a certain percentage of your audience on LinkedIn, right? So generally the people who are ready to buy now, as you mentioned, that's like only 3 to 5% of the people that you might be hitting through outbound or even through your content. The vast majority are not even aware of the problem that you solve. And then that second tier, they're maybe aware, but they're not solution aware, whether it's, purely outbound, whether it's a more like content-driven strategy, or if it's even another channel. And so there's a lot of problem awareness and education that I think like they need to go through that journey. So let's talk a bit about like what case studies. And so generally, just going back to that, the ones that get people who are ready to convert now, we find also are other clients who have achieved the result, because you're reducing that risk of certainty, because people are ultimately buying certainty, right? Like reduce the risk of a certain outcome. So are those a type of case or lead magnets or assets that you send through, which is case studies? Is there anything else that you find works well?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the market, and it depends on the archetype. So what I mean by that is like what you send to a salesperson is usually different than what you send to a marketer. which is usually different than what you send to like a technical person or somebody that's in like HR or something like that. So I think that becomes the other thing of like meeting people where they're at and their communication preferences, and getting into like the psychology of like, you're probably going to have a lot more extroverts in sales and a lot more introverts in engineering and IT. So like, what does that mean, and how does that correlate with like calls, and what do these people need to see to be able to move along? So like, you have the more analytical people that the case studies, the proof, all of that stuff matters a lot more to them. And then you have like people that are going to be more of an emotional buyer, or somebody who wants to take an action. So in short, I think it's matching the type of resource to the archetype or the target market that you're going after. And for more analytical people, that's going to be giving like asynchronous stuff that they can consume. Like there'll be somebody who is more of an analytical buyer that's willing to watch, a 20-minute video on how you can help. Whereas it's going to be hard to get a salesperson with ADHD to watch that 20-minute video, and they'd rather just hop on a call.
Yeah. So many people in our audience are founder operators running SMBs from like $1 to $50 million businesses. They're also selling into generally, CMOs, CROs, other founder CEOs. And so with that archetype, are there one or two like specific recommendations you might recommend for them in terms of resources you would send through?
Yeah. So I'm always going to be an advocate of like direct to meeting first. But if that doesn't work, then I think what works for sales and marketers is being able to give them something that they can do to see the result. So if you're a smaller company and you need to create case studies, like free work is still a great way to do work. And if it's somebody that you can get results for and has the money to be able to pay you in the future if you do get those results, offering free work, I think, is like the best thing that you could possibly do. SaaS has figured it out with free trials. Services have figured it out with free work. If you don't have that social proof, if you do have the social proof, being able to share the social proof, I think, is a really important piece to it. And then it comes back to like the offer. So in my eyes, you have the problem that you can help solve, but then you have the offer of like how you can solve that, or the unique mechanism that you can use to solve that. So that's the thing that can shift. And I think when people typically think about offers, it's like this stagnant thing that you put on your website that is like a package that somebody can buy, but you can make micro offers. At the end of the day, a lead magnet is an offer. Like you're offering to give this thing to somebody in exchange for email address or whatever. So if you think of it like that, and tiering down the associated risk of the offer, as well as like the ease to say yes, if you offer somebody free work, it still requires some of their time. So that might not even work if they don't want whatever outcome you're talking about. Whereas a lead magnet, a lot of people, the good thing about it is that the barrier to get it is a lot lower, but then you have the opposite end of the barrier of like how many people are actually going to consume that thing, and how much follow-up are you going to have to do with somebody that did say yes to the lead magnet, of if they went through it or not. So that's a long way of saying that I'm always in favor of like the more aggressive approach, but then tiering it down. So if you start with meeting, then you lead with case study next. Then if case study isn't converting after follow-up, you lead with lead magnet. And then if lead magnet isn't converting, you can flip-flop with like service trade or free offer or whatever mechanism, assuming that your targeting is on point. Something that I do want to like make note of, that all of this stuff with messaging assumes, is that the people you're actually targeting are the people that you want to work with. And if that isn't the case, targeting needs to be adjusted. When I come in to like audit LinkedIn campaigns, more often than not, the targeting is off for people. And it doesn't mean that like they don't have the right filters in. It's just they're not using LinkedIn Sales Navigator in the right way. Because of the way that filters work in Sales Navigator, they're getting a lot of false positives or false negatives because of multiple job titles, multiple companies. So while they might think that they're targeting like other founders, they don't realize that all these people are like investors or advisors or board members in this type of company, and really they're targeting founders of a completely entirely different type of company.
Cool. Well, yeah, we went pretty deep there on the outbound funnel. What I want to do is switch gears a bit and talk about the importance of content and how it complements the outbound strategy. Generally what we see, and this is how our whole approach is, how do we create it starts with your profile, but now a body of work where you're creating demonstrated expertise that you have delivered this result, like beyond any reasonable doubt, right? And that usually, it is usually like, again, like that middle of funnel content where it's highly educational, it's the frameworks, maybe it's a newsletter, if it's on LinkedIn, where it's longer form and you're walking through the methodology, how it's been implemented with similar buyers like them, what is your differentiated value, if you will. So they're like, okay, this is unique and different, but relevant. And clearly it's worked and it's proven. And then there's also opportunities for things like, webinars and workshops. And I know that you've done some longer form content on LinkedIn as well. So talk about how you think about advising your clients, as well as your own experience around building content assets to increase trust and ultimately increase response rates for your outbound strategy.
Yeah. So when I think about content, so obviously we come from the outbound perspective, but I want to say 2 to 3 years ago, we started to get really serious about content because we noticed that the trust you're able to build just increases conversions across the pipeline. And it's always been that way, but when volume went down on LinkedIn, you kind of had to play the game a little bit differently. And so in my eyes, content becomes almost a non-negotiable because it's just going to increase everything else that you're doing on the platform and even outside of the platform. So what I mean by that is response rates going up, connection acceptances going up, and ultimately revenue closing going up. And the really interesting thing about LinkedIn is, as you know well, like LLMs are picking up LinkedIn content a ton. Yep. So I think it was SEO Rush or SEMrush that published something in October of 2025 about LinkedIn being the second most cited resource for LLMs. And those are personal LinkedIn posts usually. They're not necessarily like company posts and stuff. If you think about that from the perspective of like AEO and SEO and search, the other side of it is that anybody that's coming into your pipeline, especially if you're a founder that also has a role in sales, I think that's the easiest use case because people are looking up your LinkedIn profile before they get on a call with you. And if they're able to see a LinkedIn profile that's active, large, posting content that's helping people, you already are establishing more trust and more expertise before you even make contact with that person, even though they came from, let's say, like Meta ads or came from SEO or came from referral.
Yeah.
Because you have this presence on LinkedIn that is separate, it automatically makes those conversations go better.
Yeah, completely agree there. And it's, oftentimes when I'm on sales calls and clients ask me about like, why do we need content? Why do we need a certain frequency of content? I'll usually flip it on them and ask them like, what compelled you to join the call today? What went into the research that you went into before you joined the call today, or we got this far into our sales conversation, right? Why are you seriously considering us? What went into your research and decision-making process? And invariably it's like, we saw your LinkedIn, we liked this post, you talked about this. I'm like, well, there you go. Well, based on your buying journey, do you think other buyers like you would go through a similar process? And so it's almost helping shine a light on their own process and how others are very similar to them as well. So yeah, I think that's really important. I'm also seeing the value of longer form. Again, when we think of in a world of infinite information, knowledge, and now intelligence, the nature of the content is also shifting. So I noticed like 6 months ago, 12 months ago, a lot of these like listicles, these how-to posts, these like information dense infographics, right, would really take off. But now when intelligence is on tap, what do people truly care about? And it is almost like the demonstrated expertise based on the human that they can feel. And that usually comes and is accelerated through video or some longer form of content where they can understand your thought process and there's some sort of a story and context that comes before the content, right? Or that substance, if you will. And it's like, what can you talk about that nobody else can talk about? I think that's truly like our only moat are the stories that only we can tell. And that's a thing that I tell a lot of these founders. I'm like, okay, you're doing outbound, you're doing paid ads, you have a referral channel. How much of that is in your control and how much of that is compounding over time? And when you think about building enterprise value, what do you think is the most valuable way to build a compounding asset? And so it's like through a series of questions and also just like understanding their research and buying journey that they come to understand that this is actually like a very valuable exercise, which is, again, like how do I compound trust in a way that only I can do that? And then based on that, that lifts all ships, like you said, with the AEO, with the outbound, with cold email. And then over time, they'll start to be in the position we can start filtering opportunities based on that surface area of trust that they've created.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't add anything more to that. I think you said it best.
Cool. Well, Chris, as we start to wrap it up here, one thing I'd like to ask you are there any like red flags or green flags in terms of, clients that would really work well with you? I'll give you an example. When I talk to a founder and I ask them, like, what is preventing you from getting more inbound conversations? And they defer it to their marketing team or to their product or to something that's outside of their control, i.e. like building their own trust. That's usually, it's harder to build a founder-led content motion with these sort of people. So have you found any signals that tell you that this person is ready to use our systems and our strategies versus they're not a good fit?
Yeah, I think the biggest green flag is if there is a founder-led sales motion, like that's the easiest way to derive ROI because they're already doing sales. And because it's their name and they're hopping on calls and they're in a revenue generating role, the results that they're going to see happen a lot faster just because they're already doing other things. So I would say that's a green flag. Another green flag is going to be for outbound specifically, if they've seen success from other channels of outbound. Like if they have cold email running and it's working really well, if they have cold call running and it's working really well, they just haven't tapped into LinkedIn but know it's a missed opportunity. That's another huge green flag because it tells me that one, they have product market fit, at least to some extent. They can say words to somebody and get them to convert to a call. And then it's going to be very easy to translate that over to a LinkedIn system. And then when they do take those calls, they know how to sell colder traffic, which is very different than a company that's built on referrals, let's say, and they create custom packages every single time and they haven't really found like an offer or a mechanism that sells. Yeah. So from a red flag perspective, I think that if you need outbound to work immediately, LinkedIn is not the place for that. You're going to get a lot faster results. The fastest results will be from cold call because you can pick up the phone right now, dial for 2 hours and actually see a result. The next fastest is going to be cold email just because of the sheer volume that you can test. And then LinkedIn is going to be the slowest of the outbound channels in my eyes. But where it makes up for all of that is that it compounds. And something that you do on LinkedIn today is actually relevant to a year from now. Whereas the cold call that you make today or the cold email you send, like it's forgotten in 24 hours or less by most people. So red flags, not having product market fit, red flags, needing results really fast. And I had another one, but it might come back to me.
Yeah, that's great. Great. Well, what is as we wrap it up here, we'll make sure to include your LinkedIn, of course, the email. What's the best way for people to reach out if they're seriously considering building an outbound motion on LinkedIn?
Yeah, so at uptown.com, booking a call with myself or my business partner, connecting with me on LinkedIn, and then we're putting a big push into YouTube content ourselves. We're big believers in the give away the secret, sell the implementation. Yep. So that is what we try to do.
Beautiful. Well, Chris, thanks for joining the show. We'll definitely have to do a round 2 at some point to go deeper and talk about more case studies. So thanks again for joining and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, this was fun. You too.